Welcome back to the latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Tokyo, Japan, and my special guest today is Meghan Barstow, who is the president of Edelman in Japan. Meghan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Meghan, I understand you've actually been in Japan before, so let's sort of get a little bit of the background on you. What is your Japan experience? How is it that you're back in Japan now running Edelman? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I realized this year that the first time I came to live in Japan was exactly 30 years ago. So I first came as a college student. I studied in Osaka at Kansai Gaidai for my junior year abroad.
Were you a Mombusho?
No, I was just really my the third year that you do in American universities, and you'll often spend that year abroad to get more language experience and immersion. And my minor... Had
you done Japanese in America before you came to Kansai Gaidai?
I did. So my minor in college was Japanese, and so before coming here, I'd studied for 2 years very intensively. I went to a school called Middlebury in the United States that has a specialization in language.
And what was the other major you had at university?
English literature.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
2 language majors. That's interesting.
You could say I'm a woman who loves words.
Yeah, well...
Hence my current career.
Career is perfect lineup for that, isn't it? Perfect
I just
match.
want to say that my career, I like to say that what I do is save the world one word at a time.
Oh, very nice.
So my education was all leading up to that, I think.
Nice.
Bilingually saving the world one word at a time.
Nice. We talk about in our vision mission statement that... we are changing the world one person at a time.
There you go.
We have the same terminology.
I love that.
So, obviously this interest in Japan predates coming here. So why did you have that interest in Japan in the first place?
I love traveling. I think I'm a nomad at heart. I don't like to be in any one place for too long. But the reason I fell into Japanese, I was not an anime fan. I was not a huge fan of Japanese food. In fact, before I came to live here, I didn't think I would like the food in Japan. But before I studied Japanese, I studied Spanish, and I spent a year abroad in Argentina as a Rotary scholarship student. So I did that the year after high school and before college. And then in a moment of hubris, I thought, I've already mastered Spanish. I want to study a new language, and I want to study a difficult language because I'm paying so much for it in university. I might as well pick the most difficult language possible. So I chose Japanese. Also, I grew up in Alaska, and there's a lot of connection between Alaska and Japan. And that time when I grew up in the 80s, most flights
Anchorage, right?
stopped in Anchorage.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of Japanese airline workers. Also, the fishing industry is very closely connected in Alaska as well. And the economy was booming when I was in high school. So Japan seemed like a great place to build a career.
And actually, the vowel sounds of Spanish are very close to the Japanese vowel sounds. So you already had, within the tongue-palate connection, an ability to produce a sound very similar to Japanese, which is a bit of an advantage.
I hope so. I don't know if that actually is reflected in how I speak Japanese. My accent might not be as good as I would like it to be, but maybe that was a little bonus that I had.
Anyway, so you decided that, okay, I'm going to choose something more different. Knock Spanish off, no problem. What's next? Japanese.
Yes.
Yeah, and then what happens after that?
So the travel bug, I still was living high on that. I completed my education. I went back to the United States, completed that. I returned to Japan on the JET program. Oh. And I was in Japan for 3 years in rural Japan, Kagoshima.
Kagoshima. Now,
Yes.
was it actually in Kagoshima City or
No.
the boondocks outside of Kagoshima?
I was very doinaka.
Doinaka, some
Yes.
onion-producing or
Yes.
potato-producing area down there, maybe.
The town that I was in, so I was 2 years as an ALT, which is teaching English, and 1 year as a CIR, working for the local government.
Yeah.
Both locations were rural. The first location was this tiny little town called Hiwaki. It no longer exists as a town because it's been conglomerated with other small towns. I was the first foreigner, the first ALT to be there, so it was an amazing, immersive experience.
Probably the only foreigner in town, I would imagine.
There were actually some foreigners who worked at the Onsen Hotel that was there.
Oh, okay.
A few, yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's a big experience. And so I'm sure that you've got, not much opportunity to speak English and a lot of opportunity to speak Japanese. So I'm sure your language skills really advanced quickly. So what happens after that?
So after that, I came back to the United States again. I actually worked for, I was trying to use my Japanese language skills, so I was in Seattle. I worked for Kyoga prefecture in their business and cultural center, and I was doing culture programs for citizens of Seattle and Washington State, their sister cities and sister states. And then after that, I even taught Japanese at a local public high school for a semester, stepping in for someone who's out on maternity leave. And then I returned to Japan again for my third round, where I was in Tokyo. And there I got a job as an editor creating business textbooks, business English language textbooks, working for a Time Life company at the time. And I created a textbook series, which was a lot of fun to do. And at that time, I had a lot of friends who were expats, and many of them were doing communications, mostly for automotive companies, for Mercedes or for Reno. And I started to hear what they were doing, and I thought, I think I could do that job. It sounds like it has a lot of the skills that I have, meeting people, writing, editing, communicating, but also strategizing. And so I applied for a job in the English language newspaper, and that's where I started my PR communications career.
So it was just, in those days, actually, you don't get many classifieds
right?
anymore.
I'm
They're all
dating
gone.
myself.
But so you saw a job come up, right? What was the job?
It was working for AdCom Group, and I saw that you interviewed Andreas
I
Donnenberg before.
certainly did. I didn't realise we had a
Yes.
connection there with.
Yes.
Really?
So I started in Tri-Media,
yeah.
his PR group.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized that it was sort of my tenshoku, my calling, communications. It just felt like a fish in water. So then I was recruited by Edelman here in Japan at that time.
Okay.
So Edelman was a startup, really, in this market.
At that time that
At
they
that time.
recruited you, it was a startup.
Correct.
Wow.
So it was maybe 15 people
So
at
this
the time.
must have been before Ross.
Correct.
Robert.
This is in the leader at that time was Bob Pickard.
Didn't think I met Bob Pickard, but okay. So Ross
Okay.
has also been on this podcast
Yes.
too, when he was actually with Edelman.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I'm
he's with
following in great
Yeah, well,
footsteps.
again, it's not actually about Edelman, it's about you. It's about him and in terms of his leadership experience.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
great, okay.
Yeah, so at that time, again, it was about 15 people. I was recruited to join. I was on the healthcare team in the health practice and was with them for about 3 years and then went back to the United States.
So in that 3-year period, were you one of the leaders of a team? Were you given responsibility for team leadership, or were you one of the sort of team producers? What was the situation?
Yeah, I was really frontline, right? So I was mid-level. I wouldn't say that I wasn't the healthcare team lead.
Okay.
So I was a mid-level implementer, I would say.
Right.
So sometimes I would be having, agency is very hierarchical. So of course there would be juniors working with me, but I would also have seniors. So right in the middle of the organization.
And are any of the people you work with then still at Edelman?
A few.
A few.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, that's amazing. We'll talk about that later. Anyway,
Yes.
so keep going, please.
So went back to the United States.
With
and
Edelman?
So this is what's a little bit interesting also in Edelman's evolution. I loved Edelman. I needed to return to the United States for personal reasons. So I resigned here with a recommendation to join Edelman on the other side. Now, in today's world, you wouldn't have to resign. You would just take a sabbatical, and then you would join them on the other side, and they would help facilitate that mobility, right? We're much better at global mobility. But at that time, it was really like, you'll resign, and we'll try to help you get a job on the other side. So I took about 10 months off, and I did this amazing hike from Mexico to Canada. I don't know if you've heard of the Pacific
You
Crest
hiked
Trail.
from Mexico to Canada?
I did.
Which side? Was it the middle? Or was it
On the West Coast.
West Coast? Okay.
I don't know if you've seen the movie Wild. Okay, there's a movie and a book, but it's a long trail, and it goes, as I said, all the way up all the way up the United States. It ends in Canada.
Right.
You go through California,
So are you
Oregon,
on the
Washington.
ocean side of the
You are
mountain
not.
ranges or on the desert side?
You're on the desert side.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was a great way to actually
The
get
Rockies.
repatriated. You are, actually, you're not that far. So you will go through let's see, you go through the John Muir Trail in California, so Yosemite, that area you're going to go through.
Okay.
Yeah, and the Cascades in Washington. But it was a wonderful way to come back to the United States. I'd been living in Tokyo for 6 years, and usually you have that sort of reverse culture shock. But when you're living on the trail for 5 months, and it's such a unique culture that's not like anything else, it was just the most beautiful way to return to the U.S. So I did that, and I was back in the U.S. So I rejoined Edelman in our Washington, D.C. office. Okay. And that was a wonderful experience because it's a fantastic office for us. It's where just a lot of smart people are, a lot of smart work is done, and I was able to learn and grow so much in my capabilities.
And the headquarters is Chicago?
We have, DJE is centered in Chicago, but Richard is based in New York City.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So New York is our largest office now, and Chicago is second largest, and DC is our third largest office.
Wow, okay.
But it was always my dream to come back to Japan, and it was always my dream to lead an office. So, within Edelman, within an agency, there's many different career paths you can have. You can become a large client lead, which I've done. You can lead a practice or sector, which I've done with employee experience. But I love team building. I love that sort of creating something from nothing or growing it further. And so being a country manager seemed, or an office lead seemed like a great career path. And I always wanted to come back to Japan. I have stepchildren that are in college now. Okay. And so when they were getting ready to go to college, I really believe in telling people what you want. So I started to tell my boss, I started to tell everyone at Edelman, I want to go overseas, I want to go back to Japan if I can. Is there an opportunity? And that's how this opportunity came around.
Wow, and so you came directly from Washington, D.C.
Correct.
So that's going to be interesting. So you've actually had experience leading teams in the States, and then you come to Japan. And yes, you've been working in Edelman before, but there's only a couple of people who are still continuing from that period of time. So, and you've been, doing this in-country for about a year?
Almost 2 years now. I've been in country for about a year and a half.
In country about a year and a half.
In
right?
role, almost 2 years.
So you had sort of some part when you were doing it remotely
Correct.
from the States, right?
Correct.
Because of COVID, etc. So what have been some of the challenges that you've found leading a team here in Japan?
I was thinking about that, and there's so many challenges.
Oh, great. Go for it.
I think first and foremost, of course, is leading a team. This is not specific to Japan, but it is probably exacerbated in Japan with the restrictions that we had of people coming in and out. But I have not met most of my team members in person. So we have
Even still?
Even still.
Wow.
So we've been completely remote for the whole time of my tenure. Wow. I have not met 85% of my employees in person, face to face. So,
now, is that because it's Manen Boshi government regulation, emergency declaration? Is that because it's Edelman policy? Is that because they themselves are reluctant to meet with you in person because they're worried about COVID? What's the driving that?
Edelman is very cautious about policies around return to office. So until COVID was at a certain level of, the infection rate was at a certain level, we were not allowed to have employees come back to the office. So we're always erring much more on the side of caution for our employees.
So we're talking about, about 50, 60 people
We
here?
have over 70.
70 now, is it?
Yes.
Okay, 70.
Yes.
So 70 people, you haven't met them face to face. Well, that's going to be a bit of a difficulty.
That is a
You're right
big
there.
challenge. Yeah.
Within that, within that scenario, that reality for you, what has been the most difficult thing within that spectrum?
So creating connection and engagement with people, how do you do that in a remote setting? I think every business leader has struggled with that. I think it's even harder. I'm trying to drive great change and transformation in the organization, and that's a time when people need to understand things logically, but also emotionally, right? So in change management, you're really, you know this better than most, but you're really speaking to their minds and their hearts. And so a lot of that is through experiences, right? So experiencing what you're trying to drive, experiencing connectivity. And so not having those kinds of experiences has been really, really hard. It's really hard for new joiners, people who've onboarded in this time, just really difficult. Also for people that are living alone, they've really struggled, I think, with loneliness as well, and they don't have that work setting to connect with people. And just, I think we work really hard in agency. It's a hard environment. It's fast-paced, it's relentless, but it's also very inspiring. But I think what's been the hardest is that lack of fun in work, right? I mean, work, we call it work for a reason, but you really want to have that fun side. Mm-hmm. And not having that or trying to find ways to infuse that into what we do has been a challenge.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess, in a way, it's quite ambitious to onboard completely new people during a pandemic.
Yes.
And I know, and Meghan, because I'm an absolute legendary, insightful business leader.
Yes, of
I
course.
I hired 4 new people, January 2020.
Oh my gosh.
4 new people with the overhead. Boom. They're in the office.
Time is everything.
Literally 2 weeks, and then we moved home.
Oh my goodness.
And so I know from my own experience that's not very easy. So in terms of you're not able to meet them face to face, you're obviously doing everything probably through Zoom or some equivalent platform meetings. How have you gone about gathering the troops together? Is it a weekly format, a daily format, a town hall every month? I mean, what are you doing to try and improve that inner sanctum communication?
So I've tried different things as I've gone through my tenure and where we are, in the organization, right? So when I first came, I kept in place most of the normal cadence of communications that Ross had put in place. Mm-hmm. And I spent the first 3 months really listening and having conversations. So did a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of roundtables. And then based on what I heard, what people wanted, what they needed, and also based on our engagement results, I put together a plan for communication and for the other elements of the business strategy. And so the initial communications that I had was an all-staff business update twice a month, because they were really hungry to know what's our strategy, what's our vision, where are we going, and how are we going to get there, right? So spent a lot of time doing that. I also was doing weekly email roundups, so where I would talk about, here's news to know, here's, some great wins, here's events that are happening. So trying to do a written version of information for them, because also very hungry just to know what's going on in the organization when they can't see everything, right? Especially when you're remote, you don't get that information.
And also I think the fact that it's written down is a little bit easier to absorb, because the equipment today is pretty good. The audio is pretty good.
Yes.
But it's still remote, and it's still your tiny little box on a screen.
True.
So your animation of the face or the body is usually, you're one of like 24 squares or something. In your case,
exactly.
70 squares. So it's hard to actually have that personal dimension. And so can they catch the audio in English? I presume you speak English, right? So actually having something they can read bit by bit at their own pace, and actually, because their reading skills are usually very high relative necessarily to speaking skills. Well, I mean, you've got some good English speakers over there, I know that. But still, it's a bit easier, isn't it?
Yeah. I also did a quarterly roundtables, listening roundtables, small group. So sometimes I would do it by level, sometimes I would do it by team, sort of like the practice area, sometimes by tenure. So I would do that on a quarterly basis. And then I did quite a few workshops or working sessions around the strategy. I tried to also start to engage my mid-level, so the frozen middle, you often call it in communication, so that middle layer, the leadership team -1, essentially. So that's what I did at the start. And then as I think people, started to feel that they had heard from me enough or shared that enough, and also they wanted to see more proof of progress, right? So at first I was really talking about the vision and where we're going. So from January of this year, shifted sort of the public channels to one business update a month, and then we do one strategy spotlight where we do a deep dive on an area that is critical to our offering, our capabilities. So we do sort of a grounding, and then we do 4 or 5 cases of how it's coming to life. So it's a really hands-on, very practical learning session.
And you mentioned before about when you were with Andreas at AdCom, that idea that he had about, actually had it physically integrated into the building, floor by floor, but actually having that type of conceptual approach. Now, has there been a change in Edelman's direction, having more creative brought into the company,
Yes.
apart from like the traditional PR, and so that gives a new vision, a new strategy, a new direction that people now have to engage with. Is that the sort of journey we're on here?
Absolutely. Edelman has been on that journey for about, how many years? Maybe almost 15 years, maybe 12 years. Richard convened many leaders together in Hamburg. We would have these leadership meetings, and that's where he really laid out the principles that we have to be much more integrated, that we are going to be communications and marketing, he called it at the time, which is essentially, it's not, we don't call ourselves PR anymore at all, it's communications, but essentially all of those, everyone is converging in the same space. It doesn't matter which channel you're using, but you really want to be earning the attention of stakeholders, right? And so you might use, you might be going via the media, you might be going via digital, but what really matters, a really creative and impactful and meaningful program. And to deliver that kind of program, we have to borrow many of the principles and capabilities from marketing, from ad agencies. So,
that's interesting. Are we getting now sort of ad agencies sort of bulging out and
yes.
PR agencies sort of bulging out, and we're getting a sort of overlapping circle type of effect between the two of them. Is that where we are?
That's exactly right.
So it's very hard now to differentiate yourself, actually,
Yeah.
because before it was quite clear, we do PR, they do marketing and ads, quite separated, but now they're doing more PR, you're doing more marketing and ads. So
yeah.
does that throw up for your team a new set of challenges around, okay, what's our unique selling proposition? What's our differentiable? Where's the moat around Edelman now? Does that then throw up concerns about the future? Is this going to be viable? Because there are a lot of firms a lot bigger than Edelman and those big agencies. You're competing with them. So how's that sort of conversation shaping up?
I feel, of course, I could be biased, but I think that Edelman has an amazingly differentiated value proposition. Mm-hmm. So we are, and of course, I'm always coming back to this, but we're independent and family owned, which is very different than any of the holding company agencies, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing is what we're seeing, we believe that PR, or the idea of earned attention versus paid, is what is more important now, right? Mm-hmm. That is what people are recognizing is more credible and what stakeholders are going to rely on to make a decision, to think differently about a company. So our grounding in PR and earned is really more important than ever. The other big differentiator for us that I think is so important now and so relevant is our long research into trust. So
that's the Edelman Barometer, Trust Barometer.
Exactly, the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's 22 years this year that we've been studying
trust. That's really been
a
triumph of marketing, hasn't it? Because in terms of branding the company, differentiating the company, global, people quote it, the media love it.
Yes, they love it.
CEOs love it. It has all sorts of ramifications around your staff satisfaction, engagement, survey results, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's been quite a thing. I mean, very expensive. I know that it was quite controversial because it was costing a lot of money for many, many years. And people wondered why are we spending all this dough on this trust barometer? But I'm thinking that probably that's turned itself around.
Yes, I think we're doing more studies than ever before. So before it was once a year, we'd release it at Davos in January when Davos in January happened. Now we do multiple cuts. We've invested so much in our IP, intellectual property. And that is something that we can do as an independent company, that we can reinvest profits into intellectual property like that. But that's truly... it's the big differentiator, right? And it grounds our programs. It gives us insights into what we're recommending to our clients. And it feels very prescient now that that's what we invested in 22 years ago. And it was important then. The reason for it was the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle. But I mean, imagine this year, right? After COVID, the trust impact of, the pandemic and how institutions responded to people. And now with what's going on in Europe, also the concern about fake news and what's real news, what's credible. It's just so relevant to what most of our business leaders and other institutions are considering.
So in terms of, you've talked about your, welcome to Japan, Megan. You had 70 people. By the way, you're not going to meet any of them because the company policy says you won't, but good luck with running Japan. So in terms of, you talked about the cadence of town halls, strategy spotlights, one-on-ones on Zoom, presumably, round tables, etc. Apart from those activities, what have you found that's been useful for you to engage people? And I do that in the background of the business is changing. You have to engage people to be part of that change because in Japan, as we both know, change is always seen with a big risk element to it. I'm going to be forced out of my comfort zone where I'm competent into a new format where I may not be competent. I may fail or I may make mistakes, and we know Japan's a defect-free zone. So there's a lot of risk attached to that. So what have you found has been useful to help people to migrate with the company direction, new configuration? You're doing it all remote, so this would be very interesting. How have you found things work for you and what's been working for you?
Well, that's such a good question, and it's so hard because I think I'm halfway across the river right now.
Right.
We're still in the midst of the transformation and realizing some of the strategic imperatives that I have. So I wouldn't want to say that it's all one and done at this point, but what has been effective? So I go back to change management. I'm a trained change management practitioner, and I think the principles are valid. So you need to show the vision, where you're going and why that matters. So I've been trying to always come back to our strategic imperatives. I think we need to have managers or other leaders buy into it to also role model and champion that. So that's another piece of the puzzle. The third piece is really having people experience it personally and understand what it means to them. And that's the part that's hardest in a remote organization. And I do think it really comes down to individual touch points or moments that employees have with the strategy or with the work or with the change that we're trying to drive, when they realize, oh, this is for real, or this is a new way of doing it, and the client was really excited and happy about it. So it takes time, it takes multiple experiences, it takes a lot of patience and persistence, and just repeating again and again. And I think in Japan, you know this better than I, but it seems that, the idea of doing something and then recognizing that maybe it didn't work as well and acknowledging that and say, now we're going to make some changes and try to do it better the next time, I think is quite effective, because that's also a lot of the way I see initiatives that the government does or companies do, is that continuous learning cycle.
Kaizen idea.
Yes.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. They're probably easier than maybe the type of leapfrogging innovations that you've seen coming out of America in sort of technology terms over the last 30 years. So in terms of how do you know if the message is getting through? You talked about the frozen middle before. I love that expression. I've always thought of it as sort of like those big concrete slabs in buildings, between the floors of the building, with the top echelon of the CEOs on the C-suite with a luxury deep piled carpet and, perfectly coiffed personal assistants and quiet atmosphere, making announcements, ideas and, thinking about where we're going with the company. But it sort of hits this frozen middle, and the people down the bottom don't actually understand what's going on or why it's going on, more importantly. So when you're in this sort of remote situation, how are you finding getting the message out in terms of particularly, you mentioned before, repeating, because I think often we believe, okay, I've explained that and I've now moved on. We may have moved on, but often the people who are having explained it to them haven't moved on at all. They're still stuck.
Yes.
So how have you found that?
It's hard. So how do I know if I'm making an impact and moving the needle? I'm trying to look at all the available data that I have, right? Mm-hmm. So I have my employee engagement survey, which is, people have different perspectives on how valuable that they are, but I find it, at least it's a real-time piece of data that I can use to inform my engagement program. And so every time that I get that data, I reassess what's my strategy for the next 6 months. Like, what do I really need to focus on as it relates to engaging employees and what we're doing? And so that's changed each time. So that's one piece of data. The other piece of data, of course, that I look at is, our business, how we're performing, and not only sort of the business metrics, but are we starting to deliver more in the types of work that I want to be doing, right? So part of our transformation is shifting and enhancing capabilities, introducing new capabilities that the market needs and that Edelman can offer. So are we doing more of that type of work? And then, the part that's so intangible and it's hard to assess remotely is there a change in how people feel? Does the work experience feel different? Does how they, is how they're working with each other and with the network, has that changed? Is it working better than before? And that's the one that is harder to measure, and often what you hear is only the negative feedback and you don't hear the positive. So it's a little bit hard to tell how much progress you're making there.
And that's also a point about, we've talked about this a number of times on this podcast with different CEOs and leaders about the Japanese factor in these types of surveys, and they talk about luxury retail, they have to allow a 30% swing of Japanese consumers relative to other consumers regarding their reaction to the happiness with the same products. Because if they just look at the numbers, it looks so dramatically different to other countries. You would conclude, we don't have any fans in Japan. They all hate the company, they hate the product, they hate the team. And it's a disaster. But in fact, when you sort of add that 30% back in, then it sort of levels up with other countries. And so in my experience too, when I had to go to Hong Kong, I should say, as the sort of APAC hub, and they'd put up all the graphs from around the world, and then you'd have APAC, it'd be down here, and then Japan would be right at the bottom of APAC, and I'd be getting all this grief from my boss about, obviously doing a crap job in Japan, look at these numbers, you've got to go and fix that. And so part of it I found is the nature of the questions that are determinant questions for the degree of engagement. For example, would you recommend this company to one of your family or friends to work in? That's a very loaded question, I think, in Japan, that people are not going to give that a high number.
Right.
So the sort of the questions themselves, are they really relevant for this culture? And then you've got the natural Japanese, you know, where's the middle of the fence? That's exactly where I'm going to place myself and sit there. And so I'm not going to, you know, can't give them a 5 score, you've got to give them a 7 score because they can't do 3.5, you know. They've got to pick a 3 or a 4. And so if it's 1 to 5, it's going to be 3. So all those sorts of things come into play. How's your experience been with that?
We see that a lot also in our trust barometer, and that's a question I get from clients all the time, because in the global ranking, Japan is always second to last, or third to last. So very aware
Who is Japan battling for last position normally?
This year it's with Russia.
Oh, well, that'd be easy.
Korea is quite low as well, actually,
Right,
so
okay.
similar. In terms of our employee engagement scores, so in the tool that we use, they do have a benchmark within Japan, right? So they are looking at other companies in Japan, so they are taking into account the lower rating. But for me, it's really, can I drive improvement over time rather than the ultimate score, right? So I'm looking at, can I strategically drive a change, an improvement in the areas that matter most to engagement? And so that's my focus there. And I think that's relevant, right? Because
you know, you've probably been on the receiving end of these types of surveys in the past.
yes,
And me too. And you feel like crying sometimes, you know, you get your results back and you're
yes,
going,
yes.
don't these people understand what I'm doing here? You know, how can I be writing this stuff, you know? And it's very hard sometimes.
Are you in my mind? I think you just heard how I was feeling a week ago.
Yeah, it's like, what, are you kidding me? You know, and so that sometimes can be quite hard to deal with. I was going to ask you, how do you deal with that?
I mean, just last week we got our scores in, and at first, so I will just say that when I was obsessively checking the scores, because they really matter to me, of course, because that's I'm an employee engagement person. It's, I think, a very important metric for me. So we do the survey, and I'm always like, oh, have we improved scores? How are we doing? So I'm obsessively checking the dashboard. And I checked it about a week in, and the score had improved significantly, 0.6, and I was so excited. So I was really, jubilant and thinking, oh my gosh, this is like the most amazing reinforcement, validation of efforts. And then I realized that actually I'd misread the total number that had participated. So at that time, only a very small number had participated. And as I'm pushing people to, take the survey, it goes down and down. So my heart is sinking. Ultimately, we did have an improvement, 0.3, and it's improved every time. So I'm happy with that. But what I told myself is, I need to know what's going on. And even bad feedback, negative feedback, or especially negative feedback, is so important that I know. And that anonymous format, I think, liberates people to sometimes be, it might seem almost cruel, or the comments can be really brutal, but I need to hear those, and I need to understand what's happening in the organization. And then I think about some of them, it's about workload, it's about feeling not supported. And if I put myself in their shoes, it makes me also, really sad, but more driven to try to change that, because they don't have often the ability to drive that change, but I do, and that's my job.
And I guess also, if you were sort of going back historically and looking at how that survey was tracking pre-COVID,
Yes.
and you've probably seen, I imagine, I don't know, it's probably most surveys, I don't know about yours, but probably most surveys would have gone down because the touch points with the boss are not there and colleagues are not there, so naturally it's going to reflect that. But I guess it's within that COVID progression, how we've been going, how we sort of come down, we're not sort of parallel here, or we're going back up, so if it's got any sort of bump in it, 0.3, we'll take it, right? We'll take
That's a big deal. I'm
is.
really happy. I
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to
The thing you don't want
celebrate.
is Richard ringing you up going, hey, Megan, what's going on here? There's only a 0.3 bump. What are you doing over there? That's what you don't want, right?
I don't want that.
Yeah. And so what about trust? How do you build trust in Japan, and how do you build trust in the environment that you found yourself in?
I do feel that building trust in Japan is very hard. It's hard won. It takes longer. In Japan, people are going to take longer to give you that trust. And as you noted, in a remote environment, it's even more difficult. I think as a foreigner coming in from global and coming into Japan, that's another area that it can be harder to really earn that trust.
Is there an element there around your experience has predominantly been in America, in Washington, D.C., so it's a very particular part of the business. You are a woman. Is there anything around that bias as well, that your area of expertise is not really relevant because Washington and Tokyo, no, different picture here. And by the way, you're a woman. So is there something behind that as well, have you found? Or not?
I might be naive, but I have not felt that at all. We are actually doing very well in our equity
a lot
numbers.
of lady
Edelman,
leaders in Edelman, haven't you?
we are. In Edelman Japan, we are, we have a lot of amazing male leaders, but we are very strong in our female leadership. I'm very proud of that.
But sometimes I've heard that sometimes the sisterhood element of that goes a bit missing, and that the not so supportive of their female colleagues, they think, well, I had it hard, and look at you, you're having it too easy, or who do you think you are, type of thing. I mean, it doesn't necessarily just gel that because you have a high proportion of female leaders that women feel, okay, this is an environment that is going to help me move up. Maybe it helped them move up, but what about me? I mean, how does that work?
I know I've heard about that a lot, and of course, agency, especially traditionally in the lower levels, is more female, and then as you got more senior, more male. Edelman has really changed that and has a much better equitable distribution. But I have been incredibly lucky that my female leaders have been nothing but generous and supportive. I mean, honestly, I am not sugarcoating this, like amazing female leaders across the board, just inspiring. And I have not seen any of that kind of bad behavior in my organization. I don't think that's the case anymore, or maybe it's the environment. I mean, it is one where we are hustling so fast. It's really all hands on deck, and I think it's trying to help people. So I haven't experienced that. Do
you share the feedback from the survey with the team? Do they get to see some of those sharper comments that someone has written about you or written about the organisation? Are they able to see that?
So we do share, so all leaders are able to see their teams. They can see the comments and they can see the rating. We do share the overall scores with the office, and then we share the action plan against it. Within the survey tool, we can respond one-on-one to the comments as well. They're anonymous, of course, but we can respond and acknowledge them. I have not shown the comments, except for sometimes as sort of an illustration of this point. But I haven't gone into bringing those, putting those comments on a slide. I feel, for me, that might make the person feel, even though it's anonymous, feel that they're called out in a way. I don't want to shame someone. But going back to that trust building thing, because it's so important, I think trust is, I don't think it's peculiar to Japan, but it's the consistency in what you're doing. I think it's showing that you're putting someone else's interests above your own, that you care about them as a person, that you operate with integrity. I think communication is important. When I may have lost trust with someone is where I don't think I explained enough. Sometimes, the communication is not enough, or what you communicate is not communicated or understood. But those are some of the learnings about trust building that I have had in my tenure.
What about innovation? You've got you said like last 15 years or so, Richard's been sort of moving the organisation slowly in a slightly different direction. And so this throws up a whole raft of questions around your contribution for that creative element of the earned aspect, as opposed to the paid aspect. And so that really flicks directly to your creative capacity with both words, image, and integration of the whole package. So and I mean, you do have, people wearing the hats with the propeller on it, sort of the creatives, But apart from that, there's sort of like creativity in every dimension, be it in the finance, be it in the HR, be it in whatever aspect of the business it might be. We're always looking for how can we get more creativity out of everyone to contribute and make ourselves more protected against our competitors and also differentiated with our clients. So what have you found? I know it's extremely hard when you're working remotely, but have you found any way around, even within the remote environment, to get that creativity coming to the fore?
Edelman is really creative in many ways, as you noted. So we have our creative work for clients that the creative team and strategists are responsible for, but the account leads play a role in. But we're also, it's a sort of a niche or a sidebar of creative, innovative. We also call ourselves often entrepreneurial. So at Edelman, we're constantly creating new products, new points of view, new approaches. And that is truly a very Edelman way that we're competing with ourselves and saying, oh, we could do this better, or here's a new way we could approach this. So I think that's constantly happening.
You're actually cannibalizing your own previous content then.
All the time. Yeah. Constantly. It's not good enough. We have to further evolve it. Oh, we could tweak this, or we could adapt this, or we have, how can we take this emerging area and how can we, productize it or put a framework on it and make it happen. And that's really part of our DNA. I think in terms of driving creativity more comprehensively, part of it is creativity takes time. So we have, one of our values is the freedom to be constantly curious. And you don't join agency, you don't stay at Edelman unless you're really curious, because you're constantly learning. Every time you have a new client, you have to learn. I mean, every day is new. I learn something every single day. But I think for innovation and creativity and innovation, people need time, right? Sort of that freedom to be curious. And that's where I think as leaders, we have to create that opportunity and that space and time for employees. And that's been really hard in COVID because it's been really a hectic time. I mean, I think people feel that time accelerated so fast in COVID, and there was such pressure on the business that we didn't really have that luxury of carving out time or bringing people together to brainstorm. So we have done a couple of initiatives where we have working groups. So that's one of my favorite things is let's have a working group of people, and we do a call out to see who might be interested in joining it. So we have a peer-to-peer connections working group. During the Olympics, we had an Olympic task force, so we could communicate about that. We have a Loving ESG task force or working group, and that's where we try to carve out time for those people to come together around their passion area. And then I think unlocking that passion is so important. Someone has to have an excitement for it rather than being assigned to come up with a good idea. And then I think our juniors are just under-tapped. We have not tapped into their brilliance enough because they have the greatest ideas, right?
Well, often, it's an iron, isn't it? And it's usually the most junior person. Often, quite young. In the typical Japanese hierarchy, they're a nobody. They haven't earned their stripes. Their opinion's not valued. They don't have a seniority in the company. They don't have any status or position. And yet, they are the closest group, maybe, depending on the business, to your actual consumer.
That's right.
Group, particularly in that, B2C.
Yes.
B2B might be a bit different, but, still. And I often think, for me, we brought the average age right down when I brought those 4 people in, because they're all quite a bit younger. And I realised at some point, gee, I've got this big gap here. We're all pretty old. And, where are these sort of younger people to give us some more flexion, throughout the organisation to understand the people in our classes better, understand the people who are working within the companies better, who are going to be similar age, right? And we did bring them in, and it did make a difference in terms of having a fresher, probably more cogent viewpoint based around more of a similarity to the buyer, which has been good.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling the same way in terms of hiring strategy. So for the first, we're constantly hiring, growing, but I really wanted to get leaders with the right capabilities in, the new capabilities that we needed to sell. But now this next year, my focus is really on hiring junior team members. One is to have them be coached under senior leaders, but two, to have that energy and that fresh insight. So I think to hire the junior folks, the only, when we say junior folks in agency, we mean literally just out of college or a year out of college, right? And so I think also, when I first joined, the organization was in so much change. I felt we didn't have the capacity to manage those juniors appropriately. So you do need to be ready as an organization for junior team members because they bring so much benefit, but they also require a lot of coaching and guidance and oversight, and especially in Japan where there's such sense of responsibility for those very junior members.
And I mean, the younger generation, generally, you read the information that comes out across countries in terms of surveys of whichever, whatever generation we're up to, Z or whatever it is now, they want to be mentored. They want to be helped to learn. They expect the company to take care of them.
Yes.
And if they don't get it, then they're quite agile. And because there's so few of them, in demographic terms, we've lost half of that sort of 15 to 34 age group in the last 20 years. They can easily move out.
They can go anywhere.
Where they are, they feel better taken care of. So we've really got to, I don't know if you remember in the 90s, there was a McKinsey report on the war for talent. It's like, we should go back and look at that article because bingo, here we are. We're now on the war for talent, and it's 2022. And we start again, it's a different era, but the same concept of the war for talent is still there.
It is fierce. We used to, 10 years ago, we talk about the millennials and their demands. I'm Gen X, so we like to think about ourselves as the great forgotten generation. But we're never listed in the surveys. But, of course, what we expected of a company, what we're willing to do is so different than the younger generations. But I am glad of how they're moving their workforce, right? They're demanding more, they're asking more, and they're not afraid to work hard. It's not that they don't want to work hard, it's just that they really want equitable treatment. So I do think that their demands are reasonable. They should be taken care of. They should get coaching and guidance. That is what a company should be doing for them. Now, making that happen is always
a bit tricky.
Yeah.
And, can we say a little bit about culture? Because anytime you have a change of leader, you have a new personality, a new individual, a different shaped, group of experiences, which is built up into a career, a different outlook, different vision, a value system can be different too. So when you come into a new organisation like this and you want to be the country head, well, you are the country head, so what's the culture? And you've now got the existing culture, you've got maybe some mid-career hires who've been brought in at certain times who may or may not have been integrated into the existing culture, or they may have changed the culture, I don't know. So where do you see the culture and how do you think about creating the culture in the organisation?
That's like the $1 million question, isn't it?
That's why you're here, Megan, that's why you're here. So, I don't have any answers, I'm just the guy asking the $1 million questions.
Creating culture. One thing I will say is that Edelman's culture is remarkably consistent no matter where you go. We have a really strong sense of Edelman. So, of course, there are nuances because we're in Japan versus if you go to Korea, DC, but we also really do have a very strong sense of who we are as a company, what differentiates us, and our values. So I feel that part is pretty similar. But to your point, I am trying to drive a transformation in ways of working and sort of capabilities in other areas as well. So that means there are some things about the culture that need to change, right? So it's really which behaviors do we want to reward, do we want to strengthen, and which ones do we want to say goodbye to? And then how do you say goodbye to those behaviors and how do you reinforce that to make it come through the whole organization? And again, we're partway through there, right? So the first part of my tenure was really about clarifying our business strategy, where we want to go, how we want to be positioned, what are the capabilities that we need, Now I'm really focused on what I call business hygiene or operations, which is a lot of micro habit changes that need to happen. And that in itself is a change management challenge.
Is that simply because when people are working remotely, the compliance component or the supervision component of what people are doing in isolation from each other becomes much harder to make sure it's consistent and conforming?
I think it's Edelman culture. I think we move so fast and our passion is serving clients. Right. So people join us because they want to save the world one word at a time. But their passion is not on the administrative side, right?
Oh, I see.
But we are business people. We actually run. Each client leader, each practice leader is managing a P&L, is managing a business. So there's a lot of the business aspect to what we do. Even at the junior levels, there's timesheets and there's other administrative things that are a big part of our day-to-day where you wouldn't have that in an in-house role. So that's the part where I think it's, again, what's the carrot and what's the stick for people? How do you make it something that they get rewarded for doing it? And then sometimes you have to consider, stick as well, sort of the ongoing reinforcement of why this is important.
So if we're going to give some advice to someone like you were, being sent to Japan, reflecting on your experiences in Japan, particularly this last time, what would be some advice you'd give them?
A couple of things. One is before I came in this role, I was talking to my boss and we're talking about, what I might be facing and what I wanted to try to achieve. And he was asking about sort of the nuances between Japan and global or, other countries. But I did say at the time, I believe that actually the fundamentals of employee engagement are universal. So what people want from a workplace does not change, right? So they, is a good leader different in Japan than in another country? I don't think so. I think a good leader is a good leader, right? And the skills that are required to be a good leader are universal. Now, sometimes how you engage people, how you get alignment, how you get buy-in is different, right? In Japan, I think listening is so important. And I did a lot of that at the beginning. I need to continue to do that, to check, to see how we're doing. So the survey is important, but also just one-on-one listening, asking for feedback. I think that is so important. And then I think the neimawashi here, getting the buy-in separately, one-on-one for bigger initiatives is so important. It takes a lot more time to move an initiative forward and to get buy-in here than it would take in the U.S., right? So I think that's a big learning for me. I think, we talk a lot in Japan how it sort of seems contradictory to me that in some ways it's a very hierarchical country. So people are often wanting me to decide or make a decision or defer to me. But on the other hand, it's also, a place where they say, it's very bottoms up. The way that things happen here are very bottoms up. So that balance, I think, is really hard to tread as a foreign leader, right? So how are you enabling and empowering bottoms-up decision-making, and then how are you also showing that vision and showing the direction is something that I think about all the time.
Yes, that's a very tricky balance, isn't it?
It is. I don't know if you have any insights to share.
Well, it's something that I think we're all struggling with. How do we have people engaged, empowered, committed, signed on, really want to succeed for the business. They see themselves as part of the business. They feel valued. When we do engagement surveys, we do engagement training, I should say, we focus particularly on relationship with the boss, of course. We talk about the pride in the organisation, and we talk about the belief in the top leadership actually going in the right direction.
Yes. Yeah.
But the real trigger to engagement is feeling valued, we found. We did a big global survey on this, and when people feel valued, then that seems to trigger the inspiration, the commitment, the empowerment, and the risk-taking actually that goes with that. People step up and be counted. So if people, if people feel, and this comes back to your boss skills that you talked about before, your leadership skills, that person through their what I call kokoro gamai in my books, which is the true intention, what's in your mind, and what's coming out of your mouth in terms of the articulation of those ideas and how clear and concise and precise and persuasive that is. All of those things add up to help people believe that this person genuinely has my best interests at their heart, and I feel I can grow in this organisation, people looking after me and helping me to do that. So if those things are in place, then generally speaking, people will go forward, and that bravery to put things up, but also that humility to accept things coming down.
Yeah, that feeling valued, that positive reinforcement, that feedback, especially in times of change, are supposed, are really, really important to staying in the organization and that psychological safety as well.
We've talked a lot about leadership. Are there any things, Meghan, which we should have covered, which we haven't talked about so far?
What's the future going to hold for Edelman in Japan? That's the question.
Well, actually, as a podcast, we don't really care too much what the future holds for Edelman. What we're interested in is what you are going to do as a leader to map that future out for the team, because it's all about you, isn't it? I mean, this podcast is about how CEOs lead and how CEOs think about leadership. So we never get into the nitty-gritty of how the company's going, or their revenues or profits, or share price. We don't even go there because it's not really about that. That's a different podcast. So if we think about, for you thinking about as a leader in Japan, things that we've covered quite a broad range of subjects so far, but there are only things thinking about that which we may not have covered. Maybe we have, but if there isn't, should we talk about that now?
Let's see here. I think that journey as a leader, I'm sure you ask others about that as well, but this role for me, as you noted, was a really big stretch role, right? To go from leading a team in the US to returning to where I started my career and leading a team of 70, and often, again, during COVID, it's a huge, huge challenge and a huge stretch role, which I recognize and has been this incredible learning experience. And I think that journey as a leader, I'm very hard on myself. I think I'm always looking at, you tend to look at what didn't work rather than what did work. And how do you find that balance as a leader is something that, I'm really working on. I'm 2 years into my tenure, and I still, as I said, I'm halfway across the river. So I have more work to do.
You should mention to Richard. Now, Richard, you've got to give me 2 years here, additional on top of my original posting, because we've lost that thanks to COVID. So if it was a 3-year posting, it's going to have to be 5.
Oh yeah, I'm staying for longer.
If it's a 5, it's going to have to be 7 or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely staying longer. I'm going to continue this journey. But I think that, just the personal learnings as a leader, but how do you maintain that balance, especially in COVID when it's been so hard to be, my own sense of joy or the fun of work, right? It's been really that hard work. So that's something that I'm working on a lot right now. I have a coach that is helping me also peek around corners and look at what I am missing. Is this a coach for
someone who knows Japan, or just a coach in general?
Yes, someone who knows Japan. Right. And a lot of that was, I think, just that journey about who am I as a leader. I have the idea of what kind of leader I want to be, but trying to thoughtfully flex those muscles has been really interesting. I think the most surprising part, I took the assessment, and I can't remember which assessment it is. There's so many of them. But when I first saw the results, I thought, oh, that's not really that part. Is that really me? Is that something that I really do?
It's a Myers-Briggs or a DISC or a Strength Finder or something like that?
I think it's oh gosh, I'll have to come back to you later. It's none of those. But at first I thought, that's not really how I am. But then I realized, yes, it is, how I can behave. So it did really make me pause and consider how I engage. And you do fall into your habits, your old habits, when you're under stress or when you're under pressure. But trying to have that sort of more objective view of how I am as a leader and try to systematically address what I think are weaknesses has been helpful for me. It's been humbling as well. I feel like being a leader is a very humbling job. You realize...
It certainly is. I think COVID, if you had any sort of expansive ideas or hubris or delusions about your own self-worth and how great you were, I think COVID put the sword to a lot of that.
True.
I realised very quickly. So what would be your definition of leadership?
I had a great explanation from a leader that I respect. She led the DC office of Edelman, and now she's the CEO of Edelman in the US, Lisa Ross. But she told me, a leader is sometimes you lead from the front, you're leading, showing the way. Sometimes you're standing side by side with someone, helping them, every step of the way. And sometimes you're coming from behind, cheerleading and helping people. And that's been a nice framework for me to think about leadership. The other way that I like to think about it is that I'm really trying to unlock capabilities and power in those around me. So it's not about me. That's why when you said, this is about you, but leadership is really about unlocking the potential and power of those who report to you, because the organization is not about one person.
That's true. Well, this has been fascinating, Meghan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll pull that right now. Thank you. So please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.